Okay, so welcome all. Welcome for this open seminar. It's a very special open seminar because this session is linked to a new journal we launched a couple of weeks ago. It's the Journal of Openness, Commons and Organizing, which is a very open science-oriented journal. Many of you are interested in new ways of working, new ways of organizing, and many of you notice a very strong strength in your research. It's a world which is becoming more and more individualized, fragmented, which makes that the question of commons and togetherness came regularly in the context of our discussion. And this is precisely the topic of this session. What we will try to do is to discuss the relationship between management and togetherness, management and commons, organizing and commons, organizing and commonalization process, which are questions, problems that regularly came in our discussions about new ways of working and new ways of organizing. And about this journal, JOCO, this is one of the kind of problem, let's say a political problem, because it's far beyond the usual boundaries of organization. It's a societal, it's a political issue. That's the kind of things we would like to cover with this journal, with an interdisciplinary community. Many people contributing or participating to this journal come from different fields: management, org studies, economic geography, urban sociology, anthropology, political sciences. Some people are artists, activists, so there is a huge diversity of academics, non-academics, activists, artists, students, etc. A lot of different kind of people are contributing to these events. So I'm very happy to start this discussion, to launch this discussion today with two fantastic guests, Professor Anne Koenleif at FGV, who is an expert about the narrative turn, narrative approaches. Many of you have read articles about narrative temporalities and narrative approaches of organizing. So we are very happy to welcome Professor Anne Koenleif. Many of you know as well Professor Philippe Lorino from ISEC, who is an expert about American pragmatism. He wrote a lot of very interesting things about Charles Sanders Peirce, about John Dewey. He wrote a very interesting book at Oxford University Press entitled Pragmatism and Organization Studies. So he's an expert. And it's a little bit the idea for today that you read in the article. It's to talk, to share two highly complementary approaches of organizing and the relationship between organizing and commons. An hermeneutic, phenomenological approach based on Ricoeur, Schotter, and other people that has been explored by Anne. A more pragmatist approach explored by Philippe, and many also empirical elements that are highly complementary between each of them. So I am extremely delighted, pleased, honored to welcome all of you, both of you. And Anne, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate. I mean, I think what you're doing is wonderful because we need to get out of our very narrow, conventional academic ways of doing things, and you're doing that. So you're pushing the boundaries. So I'm really happy to be involved in this. I'm going to I have a couple of slides that I would like to show. I just want to say before I begin that I'm at home in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I actually have a teaching assistant who is down on the floor there. I don't know if you can see her, but she's been my teaching assistant through all my online teaching in the last year. So hopefully she'll behave herself. All right, so let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope that you can see that. Whoops, let me minimize that. Okay. I think this issue of the commons or community, I think, is a very practical one, and a practical one that lies at the heart of the research group on collaborative spaces. I mean, you are addressing these issues in very practical ways, head on. And it's important given the world that we live in today and what's happening, which is just absolutely devastating at many levels. You know, I have a 9-year-old grandson, and I worry constantly about what kind of world he's going to live in. And so community, I think, is just a key issue that we have to be addressing in very practical ways. So what I want to do is to, in the 20 minutes I have, pull out what I see as some key issues. And whoops, let me just. And in the article, I talked about the drama of the commons, which is something that really within ecology is a concept and a practice that's well known. So it's about the commons, about ecosystems, water supply, climate, clean air, food security. But it raises a very interesting issue, and that is that we all have access to common resources or a common resource. And the drama of the commons is the idea of, does every person drawing on that resource draw on it responsibly in mutually sustainable ways? And the answer to that, I think, depends on a number of factors. But one of the key issues that it depends on is trust. In other words, do we trust every other person who is using that resource to also act responsibly? So trust is really about when one individual is willing to make herself or himself vulnerable to others. And that involves a risk, because how do I know that you'll be true to your word? If I give, will you also give? Not in the sense of a transactional relationship, but a mutual relationship. So it involves mutual trust. And some of the other factors or issues that influence this is the way that I think of them is tension. So it's a tension between individual freedom and communal responsibility. It's a tension between ego and humility, a tension between self-interest and community ecological well-being. And it's a tension between the me as an individual and we as a community. And this is what I was trying to address in the article. And in the article, I say that I use the word community rather than the commons, because I've been interested in language for a very long time. And for me, if you put the in front of a word, or if we use ization at the end of a word like organization, for me that objectifies or objectivizes whatever it is that we're talking about. And that's done a lot in organization studies. And what I'm interested in is how we live our lives with others. I'm interested in our human experience. So this is, I think, a key issue that we need to explore. Now, this particular slide is probably one of my most used slides, because for me, everything comes back to ontology. In answering those questions that I've just posed, then we need to begin by thinking about, what do I believe is the nature of social reality and organizational reality? And what does it mean to be a human being in that reality? And when I talk about reality, I have inverted commas around that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So the point that I'm making is that often what we do as academics, especially very conventional positivist approaches to study, takes an objectivist approach where we're talking about reality as if it's real, if it's independent from us, it's concrete, it's a process, it's a discursive reality. And so we can develop knowledge to accurately represent that reality and feed it back into the world. Subjectivism is that more social constructionist approach, that we actually shape our social and organizational realities in our interactions and in our language. And so, you know, we're subjectively situated. We're the people that we study are implicitly knowledgeable about what it is they're doing. And so we need to work with people to develop a knowing. And then, and this is my main point here, into subjectivism, that, you know, we're not individuals. We are always in relation with others. So we're relationally embedded, whether we realize it or not. And so if we begin to think of the world in that way, our world in that way, that we're always creating it with others in our conversations, in our interactions, but we create it between us. So we're not two individuals who are communicating. We're a we creating together. And so our living social experience is always relationally situated with others, hopefully involving relationships that encompass feelings of togetherness and of shared experience. Now I put two question marks at shared because I don't believe that we ever completely share experience or share meanings. And this is where the we me comes in, because for me, I am biographically unique. So I have my own life story, I have my own experience, I have my own ways of making meaning. You do too. So in that sense, we're a me. But if we're selves in relation with others, then we can create some sense of a shared experience. But we have to accept that there will always be differences. And this, for me, is intersubjectivity. So if we go back to Merleau-Ponty, in the phenomenology of perception, he talks about two hands touching each other in a different context to the one that I'm going to use it now. But if we hold our hands together, Merleau-Ponty asks, which hand is touching and which is being touched? And we can't answer that question because, you know, we've got two separate hands, but they're clasped together, and we can't separate that out. That to me is intersubjectivity. So our thoughts, interactions, actions, the way that we talk, there's always another embedded. historically, culturally, linguistically, personally. And that's how I think about intersubjectivity. That connects for me with this notion of relational integrity. And this was something that Matthew Erickson and I developed a number of years ago when we were studying leadership. And relational integrity is the moral task of treating people as human beings and understanding that we are unique and being attuned to those moments of difference. So in that intersubjectivity, you know, how do we connect, but also how are we different? So what if we see our world in this way as a community? How do we do research? How do we see and enact our relationships with others? How do we live our lives? How do we work in organizations? I come to a point that John Schotter made. John was a very good friend of mine, and in his last book, he came up with this phrase, which for me is very powerful. And if I just say that John loved hyphens, and this is a good example of that. But what does this mean in academic terms? Then intersubjectivity, we-me relationships within a community are about exploring human ways of being human in a human world. I just think that's wonderful. How do we do that as academics? And this, I think, is what you're involved in exploring as well. So let me just finish with some ideas that perhaps we can discuss later. So I think if we're exploring human ways of being human in a human world, then we're researching and theorizing humanly through sensibility, sensitivity, and radical reflexivity. And what I mean by that is sensibility foregrounds knowing from a human point of view. So it's not about abstracting theory, it's not about propositions, it's not about models, but it's our feeling, sensory, emotional, and intellectual engagement with our world. It's theorizing and researching with sensitivity, being attuned to living, sensory, and unique moments in which, you know, we notice ourselves. Sorry, somebody's not muted. Okay. So it's looking at those unique moments in which we make meaning, in which we notice our similarities and our differences with others, and then how we can create knowledge or knowing from those moments. And those are often unsystematic experiences. And then finally, it's recognizing that we're reflexively embedded in our world and in our community, in our relationships with others. So it's about questioning with those others what we see and maybe taking for granted, what we're not seeing, what we're not saying. So reflexively interrogating that experience. And it seems to me that that's what you are working on in the research group on collaborative spaces. You're working out, you know, how do we do this? So it's about sort of, if you like, reimagining organization and management studies in more communal ways. So I'm going to stop there. I've run out of my 20 minutes and I'm happy to answer any questions later. So let me just stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Anne. So as we discussed, we will move directly to Philippe's presentation. We keep aside two interesting comments. I suggest that we keep them on mind. One comment, it's about the materiality, physicality of commons. Is that just an issue of embodiment at the end? And another interesting also comments, and I suggest that we all keep it in mind, about narratives. I think it's more a comment about your publications than the presentation. Is the question of being together just a question of a good shared story, or is it more than that? So let's keep these two questions and comments, and let's move to Philippe. Philippe, thank you again for joining us, and I will share the possibility with you to be co-host. Okay. No, that should be fine, Philippe. You should be able to share your PPTs. Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yes, but you did not. Yes, okay. No, it's a slide share. Yes, it's perfect. It's
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you, Philippe.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. I'm always facing technology with some fear. So I try to summarize the paper, which presents a pragmatist critique of the theory of the commons, and which tries to go further to propose some kind of alternative approach to a community experience of social life in a pragmatist perspective. I'll start with cinema, if you allow me, and more particularly with the history of classical Westerns, which are very important in the history of cinema. I'm a fan of cinema, so I use what I know. And a major topic of classical Westerns is the range wars, the struggle for land between ranchers, crop-growing farmers, mining companies, sometimes railway companies, with a key question, which is, should we enclose land or keep it open? It's the central topic of a classical Western directed by King Vidor in 1954, Man Without a Star. So we have a typical situation with a scarce resource, land, appropriators, ranchers, farmers, mining companies. By the way, we have exactly the same type of situation today in Africa, in many African countries, with a war between ranchers and farmers, for example, in Mali, Niger, and so on. Now, this situation, as it is described, you see there are two pictures and barbed wires are present in both pictures and they play a very important role. My question is, isn't it too narrow a definition of the situation in the movie? What are really the temporal, social, and spatial boundaries of the situation? For example, there is no mention in the movie of nomads, Native Americans, who lived in that area. It's Wyoming and Montana. They lived in that area in a forgotten past. It's not mentioned in the movie. What about no mention of the massive arrival of East European immigrants in Wyoming? It's an ignored, in the same period, in the 1890s. It's an ignored present in the time of the movie, of the story. No mention, of course, of future highways which will cross that country, which is a kind of unsuspected future. Nobody mentioned this possibility for the future. Interestingly enough, in another Western, directed by David Miller a few years later in 1962, and played by the same star, Kirk Douglas, who played the main role in both Westerns. The title is Lonely Are the Brave. the main character, the cowboy, is killed by a truck when riding his horse across a highway. So we have a very different definition of the situation in terms of sociality, temporality, speciality, technology. Let me go back to the topic of the commons. The tragedy of the commons, to my mind, is a typical illustration of what I call the economic paradigm. Let me recall that economics as a science was invented to some extent at the end of the 19th century by the neoclassical economists, particularly Pareto and Walras, who were inspired by a book published by a French mathematician at the beginning of the 19th century, Cournot, who was a very expert specialist of rational mechanics. And particularly, of course, of the model of rational mechanics, which is optimization under constraints. And Cournot found this model so powerful that he suggested in his book, that it could be applied to social and economic facts, that we could construct a rational mechanics of social facts. And that's exactly what Pareto and Walras tried to do and did. It just requires a conservation law. In physics, it's the conservation of mass. And economics, they chose, Pareto and Walras, to adopt a law of conservation of economic value. So that economics was born as a science of resource allocation, of resource distribution, but not of resource invention. And it's based on the theory of rational choice. Now, the theory of the commons is a very typical illustration of that model. We have a given, shared, scarce, non-excludable resource in a given amount with a given list of potential appropriators, all individual homo economicus optimizing their self-interest. We have a given definition of general interest with performance indicators. It's, as a whole, a static and non-relational model. Now, at the same time, at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, the pragmatist philosophers developed an approach to community and community-based social dynamics, which is exactly the opposite of economics, of neoclassical economics. It's based on the concept of inquiry, and more specifically, transactional inquiry. Let me be precise about it. Transaction with separation between trans and action has a very different meaning in pragmatism than in common economics or sociology and so on. If I have time, I'll go back to this. The pragmatist approach is based on the concept of inquiry. What is the pragmatist inquiry? It's the continual collective exploration and invention of possible futures with a focus on conjoint creative experience in progress. Conjoint, not common. The idea is that the different participants in the inquiry have different experiences, different perspectives on the future, on the situation, and so on. But they have to do something together, conjoint. It is, the inquiry is pluralist, it involves multiple perspectives, and it focuses on differences as the engine of transformation, of dialogues, and of the relational emergence of new practices and new meanings. New meanings and new practices emerge from the general game of interactions between the participants in the inquiry, be the participants human or non-human. The participants can be technologies, objects, nature, landscape, concepts, and so on. It is an ecological view. Dewey and Bentley, in their key book, Knowing and the Known, say that the inquiry is a process of the full situation of organism environment, not transformation of organism in response to environmental stimuli, as, for example, in Simon and March, behavioral work about organizations, but a conjoint transformation of organism and environment, inseparable. And within and during the inquiry, everything, the boundaries of the situation, the participants in the situation, the general interests and the values at stake, the goals can be redefined. Everything can change in the course of the inquiry. Now, a first step, going back to the tragedy of the commons, the first step to broaden the approach was made by Nobel Prize Elinor Ostrom, who questioned the Homo economicus model by reintroducing social relationality. I quote, "Appropriators are able to create and sustain agreements to avoid serious problems of over-appropriation." So she says, well, they are not individual Homo economicus, they are able to negotiate, to find alliances, coalitions, and so on. But fundamentally, she keeps a static model of allocation, rational choice theory. There are given definitions of the resource, of appropriators, of values at stake, and so on. And she even sometimes described the dynamics of the model, the social dynamics of the model, as potentially disruptive. I quote, "New settlers are frequently highly disruptive to the sustenance of a self-governing enterprise when they generate higher levels of conflict over the interpretation and application of rules and increase enforcement costs substantially." I just call your attention on the very dangerous reading which can be made of such a quote, particularly today. The second step to broaden the model of commons was made by researchers who wanted to introduce a processual perspective and to replace the static concept of commons with the processual concept of commoning. I quote a German researcher, Euler, who said that we should formulate commons in terms of the social practices of commoning. So they move the focus from the entity commons to the practices to build and manage access and use of the commons. But still, in the background, we have a static definition of the commons as an entity already defined and conceived, rather than on collective and creative activity in progress to invent, reinvent, redefine the commons. What is a resource? What are appropriators? What are participants? And so on. From a pragmatist viewpoint, then we need to move further from commoning to inquiring, i.e., jointly creating, jointly making new meanings, new practices emerge from the pluralist exploration, experimentation, emergent exploration, experimentation of the situation. The very definition of the situation is at stake. It can be permanently redefined. What resources, values, participants will be in the future is a matter of risky hypothesis to experiment, to test. My conclusion will be focused on the concept of community because I think it's maybe the core concept of our discussion. What is a community? What defines a community? I think there are many definitions of community, and some of those definitions are perfectly contradictory. Is a community defined by sharedness, shared values, shared knowledge, shared information, shared objectives? Or is it the pluralist interplay of different perspectives on the situation, on the future of the society, of the social group, facing some existential challenge? Is it a community of identity, or is it a community of destiny? To some extent, it echoes the distinction made by Durkheim in sociology between two types of solidarity: the mechanistic solidarity of people who share values, views, and so on, and the organic solidarity of people who have to face some existential challenge. Though they are very different in their language, in their culture, in their perspectives, and so on. how could we avoid defining the community, which is to me a major danger, as what we share, but what the others don't share, what the others are not. For example, if I go back to Ostrom's quote, are newcomers a disruption? Or are they a resource for dynamizing the inquiry, creating new perspectives, new views, restarting the emergence of new meanings and new practices? The French pragmatist philosopher Joël Zask, I think, unfortunately, it is not translated to English. She published a remarkable book about mega fires in the world. She analyzed the situation of mega fires. Of course, I have no time to present the content of the book, but she uses the idea, she mentioned the idea that we need a new social contract to manage forests or to manage natural resources. And what is interesting to me in this presentation, that this notion of new social contract is not a set as it would be in a classical approach to contracting, to contracts, not a set of fixed norms for future action, but a set of heuristic instrumental mediation of transactional inquiry, situated transactional inquiry. We need some instruments in the transactional inquiry in the situation. And it is submitted to the flow and, above all, overflowing of new experience, the continuous development of dialogical relations with situations, natural social situations, submitted to the surprises that the uncertain future has certainly in store for us, surprises that certainly will lead us to redefine the commons, the resource, the participants, and the general interest. Back to the movie of the beginning. At the end, the main character played by Kirk Douglas leaves the country because he doesn't want to take part in the range war. He moves away to something else. And moving away to something else, the director doesn't tell us, doesn't give responses to the questions. Where does he go? He speaks of crossing the border with Canada, which is interesting. It's crossing a border. To do what? We don't know. With whom? We don't know. Within what limits? We don't know. No observer can know. I would say that even the character himself probably has assumptions about it, has some hypotheses about it, but not knowledge about it. The end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Can you stop sharing your PPT?
Yeah.
Thank you. So what I propose to all of you to launch the conversation is to move to the pad. So if you can click on the pad, I did my best to centralize the questions and to make it clean. So you just need to click on the link that appears in the chat. And then you will see the pad. So it's in the chat. You just need to click on it. Okay. Ah, 2 people are joining us. I cannot see them. Okay, and I will read what appears in the chat. So we have questions for Anne, questions for Philippe, and questions for both. For Anne, what about the physical, the material world in that relationship? So you strongly emphasize hermeneutics, intersubjective, narrative dimensions of commons. What about the physical, material world? What are, I think it's a question of clarification. What are unsystematic experiences?
Okay.
What about interobjectivity in commons and commonalization process as you described them in your presentation? What about narration? Is being together just a question of a good shared story? Maybe a question more related to your publications than the presentation itself. How would you relate your framework, sensibility, sensitivity, radical reflexivity, to experience of distributed work, risk of individualization, atomization? How could we investigate those modes of working? I think something is not muted.
Alors,
Sorry,
en fait,
there is no mic open. Sorry.
dans ces trucs, ça m'est arrivé hier.
Yes,
Moi, j'ai perdu mon téléphone.
I think it's Edith.
Je cherchais,
Edith Pratt. Cool. I think
Oui.
Edith, your
m'entendez?
mic is not muted. Sorry. Ton micro est pas fermé, Edith, je crois. Super, merci. So other questions we have. How could we investigate those modes of working in a more human and intersubjective way? And last question, with the ongoing war in Ukraine, I personally feel more interrelated with distant, unknown others. For expatriated Ukrainian too, the exile experience seems to be particularly hard, with the nearness-farness distinction becoming more ambiguous. With a reference here to Merleau-Ponty. Questions also for Philippe. Is there a communalization process beyond inquiry, something likely to be said? I cannot see the next part. Are there examples of such a pragmatist approach to invent, experiment new practices for the commons? Is Hans' approach more about common practice and Philippe's approach more about generative differences? So I think it's more questions for both. To what extent is American pragmatism or American pragmatist view of communities and commons American? It was my own question. And questions for both. What is missing in management and org studies research, and maybe in your view of social studies at large, to understand and practice further commons and communalization process? And I think the last question is more specific to the context of RGCS, interested in new ways of working and places experimented new ways of working, places like third places, collaborative spaces. Are third places a potential lever for communalization process? So those are, I guess that there are other questions likely to be asked directly, but those are the questions that appeared on our different media. So I don't know, or both of you would like to react to all these questions. And then Philippe, a lot of questions and dimensions.
Right, right. Perhaps if I could start, because I'd like to connect with something that Philippe said. And it's sort of, I'm going to try and answer a number of the questions in this way, rather than dealing with them separately. So Philippe asked an interesting question towards the end of his presentation, and he asked about, you know, what is it we're concerned with? Is it shared community, or is it the interplay of different perspectives facing an existential challenge or existential challenges? And I think there's, and again, it comes back to, there's an interesting tension there, isn't there, when we think of community? And it's become particularly prevalent here in the US in the last year or so, because we've seen that shared communities have led to polarization. You know, we had January 6th, for example. And so, yes, shared community, I think, is important, but it's that recognition and acceptance of differences that is particularly key, that you know, that we need to be concerned with exploring. So, because otherwise we can become polarized. So, and this, I think, takes us back to the issue of narratives, that, yeah, narratives about good stories, you know, community is perhaps where we have shared stories. but narratives are also about meaning making. They're not about just the stories that we already have. They're about creating new stories, and new stories of community, of how do we face these existential challenges. So let me make one more point and then I'll sort of hand over to Philippe, because I think that facing existential challenges takes us to this issue of materiality. And, you know, what role does materiality play? And I'm trying to think about, I live in New Mexico, and in New Mexico, we have 26 different Native American pueblos. And when I moved here, I began to realize the importance of embeddedness in our landscape. So I don't talk about it in terms of materiality, but how are we and who are we in our landscape, in our physical landscape? And the Native American communities, this is their world. So, you know, they have a sense of place, a sense of who they are in that landscape that influences how they do things, how they organize. And I'll just tell a very quick story. When I was teaching here at the University of New Mexico, I was teaching on the Executive MBA, a leadership course. And I invited one of the governors of the Native American pueblos to come and talk to the class. And that, you know, I had been talking about relational leadership. And when he introduced himself, he said, you know, my name is, I'm the governor of the Acoma Pueblo. I am the governor of the community. I'm the governor of the language. I'm the governor of the landscape. I'm the governor of the plants. I'm the governor of the animals. I'm the governor of history. I'm the governor of tradition. And the students went, that's relational leadership. And I said, yeah. They said, why didn't you tell us that on day one? Well, because I couldn't have done it so eloquently. But for me, that's materiality. It's not materiality as a physical object, but I think about materiality in the sense of who are we in our world? What's our sense of being in our landscape? And we study that in different ways. So the way that I would study that might be different to the way a socio-materiality person would study it. So let me just stop there. But I just wanted to say that, Philippe, I think that was a really interesting point that you made about shared community or different perspectives.
Yes, Philippe, do you want to react to Anne's reactions or to the questions that are on the pad?
Yeah, both, I think, simultaneously. Yes, I think this articulation between sharedness or commonality, I would say, and difference, I think is a key point. And also from a political point of view, because if we emphasize commonality and sharedness, we run the risk, I tried to mention it in my own presentation, we run the risk of having community as the key concept by closed community as opposed to the others, which is, there are very important communities which are racist, which are xenophobous and so on. So I think we must really think about our definition of community. So what is the constituting principle of a community? The problem is to know if the constituting principle of the community is the challenge we have to face together. Durkheim takes the example of a ship, of a storm on a ship. He says maybe the sailors have different offices, different crafts, they hate each other, they have different religions and so on. But when they face a storm together, they have to work together. They have to understand each other. when we face Mr. Putin, we may disagree, French with Germans, with Americans, and so on, but we are facing something. That's the pragmatist view of community. The practical view, we have to achieve a practical outcome. Whatever we share or not, don't share. Now, of course, it's easier if we share a few things, for example, I don't know, a common language or something like that. But that's not the constituting principle of the community. Now, just one more word about the questions. I try to. There was a question about is there a commonalization process beyond inquiry? My answer will be more general. I think that what characterizes the pragmatist concept of inquiry is what I would call radical processuality. Everything can change, can move according to how we can respond to the challenges we are facing. Maybe we have to integrate new participants, to look back at the very far past in history that we didn't take into account in the first move. So it's a radical processuality and a radical immanence. Everything that happens within the inquiry. There is nothing which, I think that there is some, everything that happens within the inquiry. It's radical immanence. There is no transcendental given. So my answer is no, there is no commonalization beyond the inquiry. Commonalization happens as an inquiry. But maybe I won't be too long about this. Last question, which was asked, I would like to give some example. Yes, there are many examples, I think, of such a pragmatist approach. Just to give you a very small example, not so small, but important, let us say, but not complicated. I have a PhD student who did his PhD about the safety, work safety on construction sites. And the management of the construction company, which is, I think, #1 and #2 in the world, the management tried to improve safety by changing managerial practices, by making workers on the construction site more aware of the problem of danger and safety and so on. But through the research, we realized that more or less 80% of the risk is predefined by the way the work situations are designed, were designed 2 or 3 years before. So that design and engineering of technology, work sites, work situations are key for the safety today on the site, on the construction site. So in the inquiry, you have to redefine the situation. It's no longer a situation of people working on the construction site. It's a situation of people working on the construction site designed 2 or 3 years before by engineers and designers. So you have to redefine the whole spatial, social, and temporal frame of the situation. And you see that the very definition of the commons is completely upset by this transformation of perspective. It's a very small example, but
thank you very much, Philippe. Maybe it's time to also open the floor for questions. So if people attending this session want to ask directly questions, do not hesitate. So beyond the questions that you wrote, or you can read your own question if you think that it's not been answered yet, do not hesitate. It's very, sorry.
Sorry, can I just address the question? I'm just looking through the list of questions, and the one is Anne's approach more about common practice and Philippe's about generative differences? Because that's, I think, is an interesting question. And let me say that I'm not interested in practices. Philippe is interested in practices, I think. You know, for me, practices are about what people do. And what I'm interested in is how people see themselves in their situation, in whatever context it might be, whether it's leadership, whether it's co-working, whatever. So I'm interested in the meaning making. How do people make sense of and make meaning around a situation, and then how might that meaning making influence what then happens? So I think that you know, we're coming from a different perspective. So I would say, yes, I'm interested in generative differences. So how do differences in meaning making impact any shared sense of a situation? And then how can we work with those differences, work with those different perspectives? So I just wanted to comment on that.
I think there is no dual opposition between generative differences and practices. Common practices, as you understood, I don't like very much the adjective common. I think that together would be more appropriate. Conjoined together practices. How can we work together? But I'm interested in practices because I think that there are problems of practical outcomes to take into account, to avoid the road to hell, which is paved with good intentions. We are not indifferent to the practical outcomes. If we want to save people, it's not indifferent to know if people are saved or not. So the practical outcome of the collective action, collective activity is very important. That's why practice is situated, I would say more than practice, is situated activity, what we do in the situation. But I think there is no opposition between generative differences and conjoined practices. They go together.
Any questions from the audience? Any other questions? It's very difficult to commonalize digitally, and more and more realize that Zoom is not the best way to do that. Yes, Giuseppe, yes.
I have a comment. Thanks a lot, both to Anne and Philippe for your intriguing considerations. But I am thinking at the Ukraine war, and I am wondering if in considering conflict, war, contradiction, the risk is losing the good tension of inquiry, of generating differences, because in this case, the difference is an enemy killing you, bombing your house. So it's a dramatic situation, and I am wondering how we can promote our thought in considering these intriguing, challenging features that you highlighted in your speech, considering this unbelievable situation. I am wondering if this conflict and dramatic war could disrupt our intention, our thoughts, our considerations.
I can maybe say a word about this. You understood that from a pragmatist point of view, the composition of a community, the definition of goals, which is evolving. Dewey speaks of ends in view, what we are trying to do. The definition of the community, ends in view, instruments, and so on, is contingent to the existential challenge we are facing. And of course, if we are facing a danger represented by an aggressive enemy, the enemy is not a member of the community. So the differences between Mr. Putin and European peoples are not generative differences. The generative differences can be the differences between Germany, who depends on Russian gas, Italy, which depends on Russian gas, France, which has nuclear power stations, and so on. We have different positions, we have different perspectives, and our perspective will remain different. Tomorrow will not have, because the nuclear power stations in France will not be closed in 3 months. And there will not be new nuclear power station in Italy or in Germany within 3 months. So we have differences. But in spite or thanks to those differences, if we are able to make our differences generative, which is not an easy task, we might build a capacity to face that existential challenge. But of course, it's a typical situation of existential challenge.
Yes, Fridtjof, you also had a question you wrote. Maybe you can ask it directly.
Yeah, I just wanted to understand the conjoint. Like, how do I know that the experiences actually are conjoined? Because I think in a lot of organizations, the issue is that people don't really make, so to say, the experiences together, and then employees maybe low in the hierarchy, employees up in the hierarchy, they've never really been together in the situation on the work floor, so they don't really have conjoint experiences. So how do we know that the experiences actually are conjoint? That's to Philippe.
Yeah, you know, the philosophers of action make a distinction between common and conjoint activity. Common activity is something that people do the same, it's shared. Very banal example is you need more strength than one person to push a car which is broken down, and so 3 or 4 persons will push the car. This is a common activity, they push the car. Conjoint activities, people working together but doing different things because of the division of labor or whatever, because of difference of competencies and so on. So they do different things, probably if they belong to different professions with different cultures, different technical languages and so on. But the result, the final outcome depends on their collaboration, on their cooperation. That's conjoint activity. Now, how do we know that they are doing conjoint activity? It's the outcome. Do we succeed in curing the patient in the hospital? Do we succeed in improving the safety, the work safety on the construction site? I think that's the practical outcome. Conjoint activity can be chaotic, then we don't have any practical satisfactory or satisfactory from a social, from a collective point of view outcome or not. And I think that it's only that, it's the practical outcome which says, yes, you have some level of conjointness or not.
Okay, thank you, clear, great.
Can I?
Leo, sorry, Anne, yes.
Sorry, just, I mean, the Ukraine situation, as I've said, is just devastating. I watch the news every night and I cry for the people. And, it brings me back to that question that John Schotter asked, what does it mean to be human in a human world? What does it mean to be a human being? is it a human being to kill it? Does it mean being human is about killing somebody or not? I mean, there are ethical questions there. And I mean, the war situation is an extreme situation. But what interests me, what I can maybe have more control over is that, you know, in our teaching and in our research, looking at sort of organizational life and saying, you know, what does it mean to be human in this particular context? How do I treat my colleagues? How do I treat, you know, if I'm a manager, how do I treat members of my staff in more human ways? And I think those are the sort of questions that we might have more influence over. You know, I'm not sort of minimizing the Ukraine situation, but I don't have an answer to that. It just appalls me that we as human beings can treat other human beings in that way. So, and that's one of those, as Philippe says, those existential questions that we need to be asking. Sorry, Francois, you were going to say something.
No, I was just saying that I think that Leo has also a question that you wrote on the chat. Yes. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, François Xavier. Thank you, Professor Conlife, Professor Lorno. Such an honor to hear your thoughts. Yeah, just had a question to bounce back on the introduction of François Xavier, who said that those new modes of organizing that we've been implementing for the past 2 years, they may contribute to a certain kind of individualization and atomization of collectives, and maybe in a way sometimes reducing possibilities for feeling togetherness. And I just wanted to ask you, because I feel we are in tension right now with the experiences we've had of communities in the past 2 years, for example, chatting with on WhatsApp groups with families to connect with others, or in remote work as well. And it's just that, as you said multiple times, the events we're facing are existential. And yeah, I was just wondering if the framework you have presented, Professor Conlife, could be applicable to study those new modes of work that are disseminating in a more humane and intersubjective way. Sorry if the question is not very clear, but it's just my thoughts of how could we apply it to those new modes of working, which in a way may endanger possibilities for feeling togetherness.
It's a very good question. And I'm not technologically savvy at all. I'm not on any form of social media. And so teaching it online has been an interesting and very steep learning curve for me. But you raise an interesting issue, because there is a danger, I think, sometimes in social media to objectify things, because we don't have that personal contact with people. And you know, in my article, I talk about you know, how social media has afforded the opportunity to see the best in life as people collectively work together to achieve something. You know, for example, I was seeing on the news that there are now people who are making Airbnb bookings for Ukraine just to get money over there. So, you know, organizing in those very human ways to be helpful. And then there have been these, what I call the absurdist dramas of social media, where we don't treat people in human ways. So I think there are some really exciting opportunities to explore that issue from a research perspective. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. Please tell me if it doesn't. But
no, it does. It does. It just, even the experience we had with the participant who had the mic on, it shows that we are disconnected in some ways, and it's much more difficult for us to connect with others, even though we're online. and it comes at a time where I don't know. I feel we need to be in solidarity with each other more than ever. Actually, I mean that's my feeling as a French European citizen.
Yeah, yeah.
Qui est là, je le suis moins, tu vois.
Yes, I think so, but I think that
Ouais. Pourquoi t'as laissé à la main?
Les moyens, yes.
Tu révisais?
I think that the effectiveness, the practical effectiveness. Let me give you an example. I heard a militant participant, an activist of a humanitarian organization which intervenes in Ukraine, interviewed. And they were packing weapons for Ukrainian resistance. And the journalist told the person, the woman who was interviewed, but that's no longer humanitarian action. And she said, yes, I know, but yes, to some extent, because they have to defend themselves. I can imagine that within that organization, there was a strong debate between people to know, I don't know if they are right to send weapons to Ukraine, but you see that there are always different views of the future, different futures. And you have to build a kind of collective judgment through, let us say, dialogism, sometimes very contradictory or conflictual dialogues, to know what the end in view is. For the time being, the end in view is sending weapons. Maybe tomorrow they will consider that it was a mistake. And the end in view will be to send pharmaceuticals, clothes, I don't know. You see what I mean? There are, pluralism is necessarily associated with, linked with complex situation. A complex situation can never be read in a consensual and one-way view. There are always possible alternatives, dialogues, maybe conflicts and so on, and some kind of temporal agreement on some end in view. And I don't think that social networks, virtual communication and so on changes anything fundamental in this.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Eduardo and I'm a PhD from Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan. The last comments were very emotional because of the situation in Ukraine, but I was also thinking that we were talking about this common environment we share that grants us to make some sense making, and in these cases, how I feel is like there's this disruption of this sense making. So you cannot make sense of what's going on, what's the good output that is achievable. So you're in such a dilemmatic situation where you cannot avoid suffering of some kind. Economic distress from the people on the country involved, but also people actually dying elsewhere. And so, and you are called from like in a different reality, in a different sense making, and in a pluralism of this sense making, of this making sense of what's the reality for other people. And so last night I was in a restaurant. I was speaking with a Chinese a restaurant owner, and she had a very different perspective from mine. And I was very conflicted about it. I was like, you cannot think that this way, like in such a individualistic way, in such a perspective that it's like, it's it's not where where my lens are, like on the suffering of the people there. Like we need to do something for them, but at the same time, so there are these historical moments, I feel like, when there's like, you are called to exit from your little bubble that may be your own personal space, your own personal workspace, and you're forced to share and make new sense of new realities, and try to integrate them in a way that doesn't conflict with to be true to yourself and your values, and understanding where the other people are. So I wanted to like have a conversation on more theoretical stuff, but then these last comments really made me more into the political stance of the commonality. So when you share something with somebody else, it sometimes is easier when you all share the same meaning, but every time there's like something disruptive in this sense of like belonging, you're challenged. And so and sometimes, like in this case, there's not even such a positive outcome like you can imagine. So like there's no good outcome in a way, and yet you're called to action with others.
What do you mean by no good outcome? If by our action we contribute to saving lives in Ukraine, for example, isn't it a good outcome?
Yeah, but then you have to decide, like, to give them weapons, for example, weapons for doing war on the field. Like a young man like me should go to the front line and fighting against an invader.
I don't know. There may be very diverse and different ways of considering. Maybe working to pack days and days, to pack pharmaceuticals or to pack food for convoys which go to Ukraine is more useful than going to Ukraine to fight the Russians. I don't know. You see what I mean? It's a matter of collective elaboration. What can we do which is useful for this situation?
I think there are limits, and that's like there are some limits. Like at least that's how I feel about this situation. I feel like there's like limits in how much we can help, in what's a good answer, what can we do together. I have a stance. I have a political stance. So I know it. I agree with what Europe is doing, but still, that's just how I feel, and I feel it connects with what we were talking about today.
Clearly, and thank you very much. If there are no other questions or remarks, what I propose to all of you, it's a short personal feedback based on the two articles that were behind the presentation, Anne's article and Philippe's article. And then, very simply, what I propose is to let Anne and Philippe have the final and concluding word about the general topic of this session. That was the relationship between commons and organizing. And I wanted so also to reflect on the topic of today, and to reflect through two set of comments, two very short set of comments. one set of comments that are very practical ones, let's say managerial ones, and the more, I wouldn't say theoretical, but philosophical comments. The two practical comments are about the starting point of this journal and what was in a way behind this session. It's a feedback we had from many community managers of third places, people trying to manage co-working spaces, maker spaces, hacker spaces, and they talk about this issue of individualization. And they say something I found interesting. They say that collaboration, it's both the problem and the solution. And that's also a problem. You cannot make sense of collaboration without inter-individual relationship. What are you trying to connect? Individual. So the more you collaborate, the more you use digital collaborative tools, the more you use so-called collaborative practices, the more you perform individuality. And that's a kind of trap. And it's very interesting because that's not something I heard in the mouth of researchers. That's what practitioners told me. And it's very interesting because it directly connects to what we say. The second thing, which is also connected to empirical feedbacks, and I think it's also very interesting for today because it creates a bridge between Anne Stoke and Philip Stoke. It's that maybe activity itself is becoming narrative. Managers, entrepreneurs, community managers, more and more, if we look at their activities, they are narrative. And what may look as inquiry processes, that looks more and more as narrative processes. And of course, it's probably an effect of digitalization, but I wanted to leave it as an open question. It's probably much more. So that's the two things, let's say practical things I wanted to stress first. Then I wanted to stress more philosophical issues related to commonalization process. The first philosophical issue, it's a paradox because in our discussion, there was an assumption, an implicit assumption, and it's that commonalization process are good. And I want to take the counterfeit of that. I want to say, it's a very personal view, that maybe from the end of World War II, and maybe during World War II till now, there's been a lot of commonalization processes till the 80s. And look at the result. They settle a relationship with the Earth and the planet, which is resource-oriented. And at some point, it has become an awful problem. And same for alterity and other people. Other people are a resource you can destroy with an atomic bomb, which has also settled some existential questions that are coming back today. And I find this issue of the side effects of some commonalization process, the possible negative side effect, also interesting. The second philosophical issue I wanted to stress today, it's also a question that I have only question, no answers, just questions. I wonder how to make sense of inquiry, the pragmatist inquiry process, and narrativity, in particular, as described by Ricoeur, in a non-enemy-oriented logic, in a way that would avoid, for sometimes, a logic of adversity. How to think about commonalization process in the context of climate change. Here, and without thinking that there is an enemy. Oh, the Chinese, they should avoid do that. The Indian, they should avoid do that. The Brazilian, they should avoid do that. The European, and so on. They all think in the logic of a very existential mission, a cause, in the sense of this word in French, une grande cause. The third philosophical remark, many things were around materiality, and I don't want to open a big door on this issue because I think it's big question. And I think that a lot of discussions in the context, for instance, of phenomenology, post-phenomenology, they make sense of materiality, but we have to accept that it's in a very particular the direction. And I think it's a philosophical question, but what is the relationship between temporality and materiality? And around that, and around the answers we can have to these very difficult questions. What are the implications for communalization process? It's a very complex question, but I think we have also to accept that there is a diversity of answers. And I want to make it short because there will be other events that will be an opportunity to discuss this further. But for instance, that's a conclusion of some past events. Bergson's answer is different from Whitehead's answer. And it's different from Foucault and the late Merleau-Ponty's answer, because they talk about materiality both. And Karl Marx, philosophical thought of materiality and temporality in relationship with that. I think about his PhD dissertation and the chapter about Meteor and this discussion about temporality, Klineman, and so on. That's different vision of the relationship between temporality and materiality, and maybe they open different ways to think about commonalization. The fourth, I've soon finished, remarks that came after reading your two papers and hearing also this discussion. It's how can we make sense positively of differences? I think it's important in the time we live, and to understand how generative they can be for commons and communalization process. And I'm deeply convinced that on this issue, John Dewey is saying fascinating things, and the other pragmatist people are saying things that are deeply urgent for and pacifying for our time. François Julien, many other people, many philosophers think things that are practically urgent for our time. And my last remarks, it's about potential philosophical ways to think about commons and communalization process. I think that in many past RGCS events, we were sticking to a very intuitive view. Building commons, it's looking for the common denominator. And this is pacifying. And many discussions were explicitly or implicitly around that. There should be a common point, even if it is a small one. Let's focus on that, and things will be better. And as we saw in Anne's and Philip's article, or what both of them wrote in other papers or books or chapters, there are other perspectives that are likely to be followed. And I think two words were very important: generativity, generative differences in the process of inquiry. Also a word that comes in the context of different philosophy, harmony. And if you think about harmony, there is no final point in a dialectic that makes at some point no tension anymore. Tensions are always generative, but we can maybe think about something that is not an integration, the end of something, but maybe simply an harmony, or to live in harmony together. I won't erase your difference, you won't erase my difference, but all to cultivate very simply harmony. And on this issue, Merleau-Ponty, the political Merleau-Ponty, Dewey, and many other philosophers that were mentioned today, or in the context of other events, have probably very important things. And I want to insist on that about this last issue. It's not just intellectual. I think more than ever, if we just walk on the street or look on the TV, we understand that these issues are not abstract, intellectual. We need politically to work together as academics, activists, students, artists. We need to work collectively on that, because nothing is obvious anymore. Nothing is obvious anymore. So I wanted to say again, thank you very much to Anne and Philippe for your articles, and also a warm thank you for your presentation and discussion today. And I'm very curious, we are all very curious to hear your concluding thought and concluding remark for this session.
Philippe, if you don't mind me just going first. Okay. I mean, I got a lot of notes here, ideas, issues that we've explored that I think are really interesting. And I want to sort of build a little bit off what the comments that Eduardo made. And then Philippe talked about dialogue. So there is this tension, and I talked about it as a tension between me and we. There's a tension and a connection there. And that, you know, me is not going to become we totally. And I think this is what you're saying, Francois, that there are always going to be differences there. It's the way that we deal with those differences it is really important. Not trying to persuade the other to my way of thinking, but accepting there are differences, not making judgments about those differences, but saying, how can we work with them? How can we build on them to build a community that accepts both sharing and difference? How do we work with that? And, you know, for me, what I'm interested in is how do we do that through dialogue? I teach epistemology. And so, you know, I talk to my PhD students about social constructionism, pragmatism, socio-materiality, feminist epistemologies. And my point is that not one of them is the best way of doing something. Everything has something different to offer. And what we have to figure out as academics is what makes sense to us. You know, what are we passionate about? What do we want to work with? Is it socio-materiality? Is it phenomenology? Is it narrative? Because they all tell us something different. You know, and I've just written an article on this that's just got accepted, that, you know, we shouldn't force people into particular ways of theorizing, just as we shouldn't force the people into particular ways of living, because how do we know what's right? We should accept those differences. So my sort of final point is, you know, as academics, how do we work with those differences? How do we make them generative? How do we deal with the surprises in the conversations that we have with research participants, and make sense of those in ways which will resonate with others? And I think that's the key. It's not about imposing a view. It's about offering something that resonates, that provokes people to reflect and be reflexive about the situations in which they find themselves.
Thank you very much, Anne.
I'm just thinking of dialogue. I think that to some extent, we build the configuration of possible dialogue and impossible dialogue. I'm thinking of the question of a young participant who spoke of people suffering. Maybe because I spent my youth in North Africa and then in South America, in countries where people suffering was not a discovery. I was born in areas where people suffered of poverty, of oppression. In Argentina, I had many friends who had to go to exile when the military coup took place, or who were tortured. I don't think that dialogue with the military dictatorship in Argentina is possible. So to some extent, we have to, in a social group, to build together the configuration of the situation, which is socially constructed, the configuration of what is acceptable and not acceptable, the valuation of the situation. The process of valuation, values are not given. They are not a transcendental given. We have to build the values in the situation due to what we want to achieve. If we want to achieve the respect of human rights, we don't have the same type of configuration of dialogue than if we want to achieve richness of a small group of people. So maybe I'm saying very obvious things, but I'm just thinking of an article written by Dewey about financial accounting and the rate of profit in American companies. It's not the best known papers by Dewey, but he wrote a lot about financial accounting, about finance, about business. And he says that taken for granted that the performance of an organization is profit rate is not, it's a problem not because it's bad, but because it prevents from having the type of valuation process, dialogical valuation process, pluralist valuation process, contradictory valuation process that we should always have in any situation, in any organization. This ready-made ways of evaluating values. So my conclusion would be, as researchers, as scholars, we should be humble because we are one voice speaking with other voices of people who in most situations are more concerned than we are. People who by definition in many situations suffer. Suffering is not a discovery with the Ukrainian war. There were many people suffering before the Ukrainian war. Ukraine is closer culturally and geographically and so on, but there were terrible wars in Yemen, in Ethiopia, in many places in the world. So I think that we should be open to listening to other voices, voices of people who are more concerned than we are, and trying to contribute humbly to defining ends in view. That's a very humble definition of research, but I think the best we can do is contribute to define, if possible, effective ends in view to improve the situation from a human, from a social point of view, nothing more. But this, at times, sometimes, requires that we exclude people from the community. We exclude perspectives. We are not in a world of softness. This requires that at times we make choices, and strong choices.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you, Anne. Great concluding words for a great session, a great start for this discussion about comments and openness. So thank you again. Just to share quickly an information about the next open seminar. The next open seminar will be with Gibson Burrell and Varda Wasserman, and it will be about critical spacing. Gibson will discuss the symbolic space of academia, and he will offer a critical discussion based on his experience, a philosophical discussion, an historical discussion about the relationship between academia, openness, commonalization. And Varda will discuss more organizational spacing and offer a critical perspective on organizational spacing illustrated by female entrepreneurship in Israel. So a great second session coming soon. You have all the detail on the website and the social media, so do not hesitate to register. And it will be mainly based on the interview of Gibson Burrell, realized and managed by Guylaine Phaeton-Aubrich with us today. So do not hesitate to join us. Do not hesitate to add your feedback on the Framapad. We will keep it open till Friday evening. So if you want to add something, do not hesitate. Questions, comments, references you would find interesting for the audience. And I want to repeat the principle of all this. We want to avoid a dead article, a dead journal. We want to have we want the papers to have a life on their own. So Anne and Philip's papers will be connected to this video, to the chat, and to the Framapad. And people will be able very soon to read not only the papers, but also to watch the video and to look at the archive of our discussion. And if you have any idea, innovative idea about how to open further our discussions, journal and video, do not hesitate to send your feedbacks to Guylaine, Emmanuel, me, and Michael. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne, for your time. Thank you, Philippe, for your time as well. Thanks for sharing with patience your research and your views about commonalization. See you all very soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.